Imagine the smell. Iron, salt, and decay, baked into stone under the Istanbul Sunday. This small fountain wasn't for decoration. It was for the royal executioner to wash the blood from his hands and axe right at the palace entrance, a permanent warning written in rust-colored stains. In the private letters of 17th-century European ambassadors, they described not just the fountain, but the severed heads displayed in niches beside it, sometimes fresh. But why was this horror so public, so routine? What kind of system turns state murder into a piece of architecture? The answer is far more disturbing than a bloody axe. Official histories sanitize these events, but the hidden records reveal a calculated science of cruelty. While commoners faced the blade, the Sultan's own family met a silent, more intimate fate designed to be the ultimate psychological torment. Subscribe and join our investigation as we uncover the twisted logic that dictated who faced the sword and who was condemned to the chilling embrace of the silk cord. To even begin to understand this, you have to reimagine what a palace island. Forget a home, forget a seat of government. The Topkapı Palace was a finely tuned machine of absolute power, and its most important function was demonstrating the Sultan's authority over life and death itself. He was the shadow of God on earth. His whisper could raise a man from poverty or condemn him to oblivion without trial or appeal. Every inch of this place was designed to reinforce that terrifying reality. That little fountain, the one we started with, its sound wasn't the gentle burble of a garden feature. It was the sound of constant, mundane cleansing after acts of unimaginable violence. A sound that told every visitor, every courtier, every servant, that their life was held on a razor's edge. The horror was the point. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. The visual dissonance is what modern minds struggle with. The most intricate tile work, the most decadent silks, the most beautiful calligraphy, and right next to it, the preserved head of a disgraced governor staring blankly from a stone niche. This wasn't chaos. This was order. A brutal, terrifying order. And yet, for all this public spectacle of blood and steel, the most shocking acts of violence were the ones nobody ever saw, the ones that happened in silence, behind closed doors, without spilling a single drop of blood. As we dig deeper into the palace archives and the suppressed accounts of those who witnessed this system firsthand, you will see that the public executions, as gruesome as they were merely the theater. The true, soul-crushing cruelty was reserved for the Sultan's own bloodline. What you've seen so far is just the warning written on the wall. Next, we take you inside the wall, where a strange and sacred law demanded a fate far worse than the executioner's axe. We promised to take you inside the wall, and now we are here. In the conceptual heart of the Ottoman Empire, the Topkapı Palace. To understand the cruelty, you must first understand the power. The Ottoman Sultan was more than a king. He was considered the Zilullah I-Fil Alam, the shadow of God on earth. His power was absolute. His word was law. This wasn't just a title, it was a theological shield. To question his command was not merely treason, it was blasphemy. From this fortified labyrinth, a city within a city, he enforced a system of control built on one unshakable foundation: fear. The state's survival, as he saw it, depended on the swift, brutal, and unquestioned elimination of any threat. But this wasn't simple murder. It was a science. And the greatest threat to an absolute ruler often comes not from outside the walls, but from within his own family. Unlike many European monarchies with their clear rules of succession, the Ottoman tradition held that any son of the Sultan had a legitimate claim to the throne. The moment a sultan died, a deadly clock started ticking. His sons, who were brothers just moments before, became mortal enemies in a zero-sum game for survival. There could be only one victor, the rest would face death. This brutal reality was codified into law by Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. His state code, the Fatih Kanunnamesi, contains a clause so cold it freezes the blood. It states, "For the welfare of the state, whichever of my sons succeeds to the throne, it is fitting that he should kill his brothers." This was fratricide, the murder of one's own sibling, enshrined as state policy. A political problem was solved, but it created a terrifying theological paradox. According to sacred tradition, the blood of the Ottoman dynasty, the Sultan's own bloodline, could not be spilled. So, how do you obey the law and execute a prince when you are forbidden from shedding his blood? The answer required an entirely new infrastructure of terror. An intimate, silent method that left no physical wound but inflicted the ultimate horror. That chilling paradox, how to legally murder a prince when his blood is sacred and cannot be spilled, forced the creation of a secret, silent method. But before we slip into the horrifying privacy of the inner palace, you must first understand the sheer, unapologetic brutality of the public system. We need to go back to the imperial gate, the Bab-u-Humayun. Picture this. You are a foreign ambassador in the 17th century, arriving for your first audience with the most powerful man in the world. You pass through the monumental gate, expecting grandeur, and you are met with the overwhelming noise and energy of the first courtyard. But then you notice something small, almost insignificant. A modest fountain, the Shelat Cheshmesi. This isn't for refreshment. Its sole purpose, documented in court records, was for the chief executioner to wash the blood from his hands and his axe after a public decapitation. 17th century travelers described the stone basin as being perpetually stained, a dark rust color, the air around it thick with the smell of iron and decay. And as you tear your eyes away from the fountain, you see them. The Ibrit Taşları, the warning stones. These were small niches built directly into the gate, and their purpose was even more direct. They were display cases for the severed heads of the Sultan's enemies. Treasury records even detail payments for salt and honey to preserve the heads of rebellious governors on their long journey to the capital, ensuring they were still recognizable upon arrival. A high-ranking official like a Grand Vizier might have his head presented on a silver platter. This wasn't hidden away. This was the empire's welcome mat, a calculated architectural statement of absolute power. Every single person who entered the heart of the empire was forced to confront this visceral reality. This public theater of blood, however, was for commoners and officials. All of it, the fountain, the heads, the spectacle of the blade, was for outsiders, for enemies of the state. But for enemies within the family, a different set of tools was required. No blade, no fountain, just a length of silk and the terrifying silence of men who could neither hear nor speak. That length of silk and those silent men were the answer to the paradox we've uncovered. For all the public brutality at the imperial gate, there was one inviolable rule. The sacred blood of the Ottoman dynasty could not be spilled. This belief was the bedrock of their legitimacy. To shed the blood of a prince was to tear a hole in the divine fabric of the empire itself. So, for the Sultan's own family, his brothers, his sons, a different method was required. Something silent, intimate, and in its own way, even more terrible. The tool of choice was the silk bowstring. Think about that contrast for a moment. This wasn't a crude rope. It was an object of immense luxury, a status symbol woven from the finest threads, now repurposed into an instrument of slow asphyxiation. It was a tool of supposed honor, used for the ultimate dishonor. And the men tasked with wielding it were perhaps the most chilling component of this entire system. The dilsiz, the court's deaf mutes. The logic was as brilliant as it was monstrous. These men were chosen for their silence. They could not hear the desperate pleas or last words of their royal victims. They could not be swayed by promises or threats. And most importantly, they could never speak of what they had done. The secrets of the dynasty's darkest moments would be locked forever, within minds that had no voice. The act itself was a horrific struggle. It was not a quick, merciful death. It was a garroting, a violent and intimate battle for breath, with the silent executioners using their full body weight to tighten the cord against a struggling prince. It was a deeply psychological form of murder, forcing the victim to face his killers in a silent, desperate embrace until the very end. This entire terrifying system, the sacred law, the silk cord, the silent executioners, was not just a theory. It was a well-oiled machine waiting for a victim. And in 1553, during the golden age of the empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, the machine would be turned against the most beloved, popular, and powerful prince in Ottoman history. A man who had to die precisely because he was seen as the perfect successor. The year is 1553, and the man this machine was built for is Şehzade Mustafa. By every measure, Mustafa is the empire's golden son. As the eldest heir of Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, he is a brilliant and seasoned military commander, a just governor, and overwhelmingly popular with the formidable Janissary corps and the common people alike. He is the living embodiment of the empire's future, the perfect successor his father could hope for. And that is precisely why he has to die. In the venomous corridors of the Topkapı palace, a conspiracy is taking root, nurtured by a desperate fear of his power. Suleiman's wife, Hürrem Sultan, sees Mustafa as the one obstacle standing between her own sons and the throne. Alongside the Grand Vizier, Rustam Pasha, she begins a masterful campaign of psychological warfare. Whispers turn to poison. Rumors are carefully planted, suggesting Mustafa is growing too powerful, too popular with the army. Forged letters are produced, implying he is secretly negotiating with the Ottomans' mortal enemies, the Safavids, to stage a coup and seize the throne from his aging father. Suleiman, isolated on military campaign and besieged by these insidious reports, begins to believe the lies. The paranoia of an absolute ruler is a powerful weapon for those who know how to wield it. In October, while the imperial army is encamped near Ereğli in Anatolia, the trap is sprung. A summons is sent. Mustafa is to present himself at the Sultan's imperial tent immediately. His advisors and closest friends plead with him not to go, warning him that it is a death sentence passed in secret. But Mustafa, in a fatal display of loyalty, believes he can reason with his father, that his innocence will protect him. He rides into the camp, seeing the grim, silent faces of the soldiers who once cheered his name. He walks alone towards the center of power, the place where his fate has already been decided. He pushed aside the heavy flap of his father's tent, expecting to face his accusers and plead his case. Instead, he was met with absolute silence, and the 7 men waiting for him inside. The 7 men were the Sultan's dilsiz, his elite, deaf-mute executioners. In the suffocating silence of the tent, a space deliberately constructed with multiple partitions to muffle sound, they moved to surround him. Can you imagine the sheer psychological terror of that moment? Facing assassins who could not hear your pleas for mercy, who could not be reasoned with, whose faces would betray no emotion as they carried out their task. This was not to be an execution, it was to be an erasure. According to the detailed accounts gathered by the Habsburg ambassador Ogier Hizlin de Buzbek, whose informants were present in the camp, what happened next was not the swift, clean procedure the Sultan intended. Şehzade Mustafa, a man of documented and unusual physical strength, fought for his life. When the executioners threw the silk bowstring around his neck, he didn't submit. He fought back with the fury of a cornered lion, overpowering the first men who assailed him. It was a gruesome, frantic, and deeply personal struggle hidden behind layers of imperial silk. The tent would have shuddered with the muffled sounds of the fight, a desperate, silent ballet of death. It was only when another court official, witnessing the failure, threw himself upon the prince that the executioners could finally gain the upper hand and tighten the cord. The life of the empire's golden son was extinguished in a silent, brutal struggle for breath. And then, the final, chilling act of this family tragedy unfolded. Sultan Süleyman, who had reportedly been listening to the entire ordeal from behind a screen, emerged to gaze upon the lifeless body of the son he had just ordered murdered. The execution was complete, but the political theater had just begun. Mustafa's body was placed on a carpet and displayed before the imperial tent for the entire army to witness. The message was unambiguous. Loyalty was irrelevant, popularity was a death sentence, and the Sultan's power was absolute. It was a masterclass in eliminating an internal threat. But what happened when the threat wasn't a rival son, but a trusted general who brought shame and failure to the empire on the world stage? For that, an even more public and gruesome lesson was required. The murder of Şehzade Mustafa sent a clear message. No one, not even the heir to the throne, was safe from the Sultan's paranoia. It was a masterclass in eliminating an internal threat. But it wasn't just rivals who met the executioner. In the Ottoman system, catastrophic failure was the same as treason. To understand this, we must travel forward to the year 1683 and the towering ambition of one man, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha. As the second most powerful man in the empire, he launched one of the most audacious campaigns in Ottoman history, the Siege of Vienna. This was to be the crowning achievement of his career and a defining moment for the empire. A final push that would shatter the Habsburgs and establish Ottoman dominance deep in the heart of Europe. The Sultan granted him a colossal army and almost unlimited resources. The stakes were absolute, and the failure was equally absolute. After a 2-month siege, the Ottoman army was crushed by a massive European relief force. The defeat wasn't just a loss, it was a rout, a catastrophic humiliation on the world stage that would mark a turning point in the empire's fortunes. The blame had to fall somewhere, and it fell directly on the Grand Vizier. In this system, there was no room for excuses or quiet retirement. He had been entrusted with the Sultan's sacred honor and had failed spectacularly. An order, a hat, sheriff, was dispatched from the palace in Istanbul to his winter encampment in Belgrade. The order was not for his dismissal, it was for his life. The Sultan's chief executioner, the Topkapı Basha, was sent to carry out the sentence personally. On Christmas Day, 1683, Kara Mustafa Pasha, knowing the system he served, calmly submitted to the Sultan's will. The silk cord was brought out, a sign of respect for his high office. But his death was only the beginning of his punishment. What the Sultan demanded next would turn his body into a gruesome political trophy. A message sent across hundreds of miles, preserved in straw and salt. But it gets worse. As promised, his death was only the beginning. Hidden court records and Ottoman chronicles describe the chillingly methodical procedure that followed. On that Christmas day in Belgrade, after the life had been choked from Kara Mustafa Pasha by the silk cord, the executioner drew a blade. The first act of desecration was post-mortem decapitation. The honor afforded to him in death by the silk cord was immediately revoked by the sword. His head was now a separate object, a piece of state property to be processed. The next step was a feat of crude, practical forensics. To ensure the head would survive the hundreds of miles journey back to Istanbul without decomposing into an unrecognizable mess, it was stuffed with straw and salt. Imagine that for a moment. The head of the second most powerful man in the empire being hollowed out and packed like a hunting trophy. A courier was then dispatched, carrying this gruesome package on a long ride back to the capital. This wasn't just about confirming a kill, it was a traveling exhibition of the Sultan's displeasure. When the head finally arrived at the Topkapı Palace, it was presented to the Sultan, physical proof that his will had been done. After this private inspection, it was taken outside for its final public appearance. It was placed on a silver platter and set upon one of the warning stones at the imperial gate, the very same ibret taşları we saw earlier. There it sat, a silent testament to the ultimate price of failure, a warning to every pasha, general, and courtier who passed by. The fates of Şehzade Mustafa and Kara Mustafa Pasha show how the system eliminated singular threats, a powerful rival, a failed general. But what happened when the threat wasn't one man, but an entire institution? A legion of soldiers embedded in the heart of the empire who had the power to make and unmake sultans. By the early 19th century, the Sultan faced a rot so deep it couldn't be cut out with a single execution. It would require a massacre. The fates of Şehzade Mustafa and Kara Mustafa Pasha show how the system eliminated singular threats, a powerful rival, a failed general. But what happened when the threat wasn't one man but an entire institution? This brings us back to the River of the Dead. Who were those thousands of bodies? They were the Janissaries. For centuries, they were the Sultan's unbreakable guard, the most feared infantry in the world, forged from a unique system that took young boys from Christian families across the empire. They were converted, educated, and trained to have only one loyalty: the Sultan himself. They had no family but their core, no father but the Sultan. This fanatical devotion made them an unstoppable force on the battlefield, but by the early 19th century, that loyalty had curdled into a corrupt and terrifying power unto themselves. They had become kingmakers and kingbreakers, a bloated Praetorian guard who could, and often did, dethrone and murder any sultan who dared to challenge their privileges. They were a rot at the very heart of the empire, preventing any attempt at modernization or reform. Sultan Mahmud II, a ruler who understood his empire was falling behind the West, knew that to save it, this ancient institution had to be utterly destroyed. The final confrontation came in June of 1826. Sensing their power slipping away as Mahmud built a new European-style army, the Janissaries did what they had always done. They revolted. They marched to the Hippodrome, the Atmadana, and overturned their giant soup cauldrons, the traditional signal of rebellion. But this time, the Sultan did not cower. He did not negotiate. He answered with a move of shocking finality. He unfurled the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, calling on all loyal Muslims of Istanbul to rise up with him, framing the coming conflict not as a political dispute, but as a holy war against traitors. Sultan Mahmud II had made his decision. This would not be a negotiation. It would be an annihilation. As the Janissaries gathered in their thousands, they had no idea they weren't preparing for another rebellion. They were marching to their own execution. The official history, written by the court historian, would give this event a sanitized, almost glorious name: the Vaka-i-Hayriye, or the Auspicious Incident. The reality was a bloodbath. On June 15, 1826, with the Janissaries massed in rebellion around their barracks in the Atmadana, Sultan Mahmud II gave the order. He did not send in infantry, he sent his new, modern artillery corps, the very units the Janissaries had refused to accept. The cannons opened fire not on an army, but on a trapped mob. Explosive shells and grape shot tore through the old wooden barracks, turning them into splintered slaughterhouses. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. Eyewitness accounts from foreign residents describe the air filled with the incessant roar of cannons for hours, a terrifying plume of smoke rising over the city, and the sickening smell of burning flesh that lingered for days. The official records, in a document titled Usi Zafar, or The Foundation of Victory, would later claim that around 60 Janissaries died in the initial assault. But this was a deliberate lie of omission, a number designed to make the event seem like a clean, surgical strike. Declassified British Foreign Office dispatches and other European accounts paint a far more horrific picture. They suggest the final death toll, including the brutal aftermath, was likely closer to 20. Because the horror did not end when the cannons fell silent. What followed was a citywide manhunt that lasted for weeks. Loyal troops swept through Istanbul, hunting down any surviving Janissaries who had fled, executing them in the streets where they were found. The city was littered with the dead. The Sultan's victory was absolute, but it came at a horrific price. There was no time for burials, no room for graves. The authorities needed a solution, a quick and efficient way to dispose of thousands of corpses. And so, they turned to the ancient flowing heart of the city itself, the Bosphorus. And so we are here, full circle, back at the waters of the Bosphorus. This is the truth of the auspicious incident. The citywide manhunt that followed the bombardment killed thousands more. Men were executed in the streets, in their homes, and their bodies were simply thrown into the water. For weeks, the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn became a mass grave. What you are looking at is the result of a forensic and environmental catastrophe, a detail the official histories conveniently omit. Merchant ship logs and the private diplomatic letters of foreign ambassadors, hidden from public view for over a century, document the horror in unflinching detail. They describe thousands of corpses floating on the currents, bumping against the hulls of ships, and washing up along the shoreline. Shipping was actively disrupted, as captains had to navigate through the dead. Local fishermen refused to cast their nets for months, knowing what they would find. This was not a secret. The entire population of the greatest city in the empire was forced to live with this spectacle, this stench of mass death, for weeks on end. This was the reality that the official name, the auspicious incident, was designed to erase. The official history, the Usi Zafer, speaks of a swift, necessary victory that secured the future of the empire. It makes no mention of the river, no mention of the weeks of decay. It omits the truth that the Bosphorus, the lifeblood of their city, was choked with the victims of a ruler's absolute will. An entire military corps, an institution centuries old, was erased from history and washed out to sea. The system of Ottoman power had proven it could eliminate any threat, from a single prince in a silent tent to thousands of soldiers in a chaotic city. But what is the legacy of such a system? What does it tell us about the nature of absolute power and the terrifying logic that turns a fountain into a tool of fear and a river into a grave? The answer to that question is the most unsettling part of this entire story. The Ottoman system of execution wasn't born from madness, but from a terrifyingly coherent logic. It was the belief that for power to be absolute, one must be willing to commit absolute horror. The cruelty was never random. It was a calculated tool, a form of political communication where the message was always the same. Obedience is survival, and defiance is annihilation. The instruments of this system, the ones we have uncovered from the hidden records, were each tuned to a specific frequency of fear. The executioner's fountain was the instrument of public terror, a mundane piece of architecture that normalized daily bloodshed and reminded every visitor that their life was a gift from the Sultan. The silk cord was the instrument of private, dynastic terror, a silent tool that enforced the brutal calculus of succession and proved that not even the bond between a father and son could withstand the pressures of the throne. And the river of the dead was the instrument of mass terror, the horrifying proof that when the state felt existentially threatened, it had the capacity to commit slaughter on an industrial scale and then simply wash the evidence away. Today, tourists walk past that small fountain in the Topkapı Palace, oblivious to the echoes in the stone. They take pictures where ambassadors once trembled, standing on ground that was once stained with the blood of the powerful and the disgraced. And that is perhaps the final lesson. These systems of cruelty are not just a thing of the past. The terrifying logic that created them, the belief that order requires horror, that stability demands atrocity, is a timeless threat. The fountain, the cord, and the river are all echoes of a warning about the terrifying capacity of human beings to systematize cruelty, and the even more terrifying capacity of time to make us forget.